Hello and welcome to HQ, where the lessons are 5 minutes and the learning lasts a lifetime. In yesterday's lesson, we learned about why Columbus sailed west. And in today's, we're going to learn about what exactly happened when he did, namely the effect on Native Americans. So, is that we're going to look at these three groups and we're going to see what their life was like before, and then we're going to look at what life was like after for these groups of people. So let's first off start with the Taina, because these are the first people that Europeans come in contact with. Now, before Columbus made contact with the Taino, they, through archaeological evidence, we know this, they lived in small communities. They really were more subsistence farmers than anything else. That means that they just grew what they needed to eat. They didn't really have a market like we would think of, where they grow so much and they have excess and they can sell it. They didn't really have that. The Aztecs were a very, very complex and sedentary people, meaning that they lived on farms and communities. They built temples. They had kings and priests and warriors. They lived among other, what almost would be considered very closely to nation states, that old Greek term, or almost like a city-state, even more would be more accurate. But the city of Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, was the beating heart of the Aztec Empire. And it was a big, big urban center. It rivaled some of the largest cities in Europe at the time. This is 1520, give or take. This is a very complex culture, and I want us to keep this in mind. They are a very dense culture. There are lots of people living very close to one another. This is also mirrored in our third culture, the Mississippian culture. Now, these people are also called the Mound Builders because they built giant mounds that they then leveled the top off of and built temples on top of. Temples where their priests lived, where they kept a sacred fire, and where their kings lived. Now, these were also a very complex people. They were very sedentary. They lived in large cities, the biggest being Cahokia. It had probably around 10,000 people at its peak, which is very large for North America. And in fact, Cahokia was the third largest city in North America outside of Mexico. Now, since Cahokia, the Mississippian culture, and the Aztecs both lived in large, complex urban societies, they go against the grain of what we think an Indian culture usually is. And when we think of Indian cultures, we usually think of teepees, right? Or little small huts or villages. This is the complete opposite. These are very, very, very urban, very, very, very complex societies. And we need to keep this in mind, that they're urban. Keep thinking about this, okay? Keep that in your head. Keep it right up there, because we're going to come back to it. And many times we, as modern day people, think, when we're thinking back to the natives, of how they lived kind of in harmony with nature, right? And how they didn't really destroy nature. They were more, going with the flow, I guess you could say, with nature. When we as modern day people think of the Native Americans, we usually think of them as being in harmony with nature. And that's why this episode is called The Fall of Eden, because in Eden, the biblical story of Eden, Adam and Eve live in harmony with nature until they are kicked out. Now, we're going to see what exactly made the natives get kicked out of Eden. So now that we've looked at what life was like for natives before Columbus set foot in the New World, let's look at what life is like after he does. And the biggest difference is the complete lack of people. The urban centers fall apart. Everything goes crazy in the New World. And it goes crazy because of one big thing. And this one big thing is disease. Like I said earlier, these Native Americans do not have any kind of big communicable diseases. They have arthritis, they have syphilis, but outside of that, they're very, very healthy people. But because they're so healthy, they have no immunities to diseases like measles, syphilis, typhus, smallpox, whooping cough. These things kill immense numbers of natives. Even such little things as we think of today, like chickenpox, just kills so many people. It's recorded that on the islands where the Taino people live, when the Spanish first arrived in 1492, and in larger numbers in 1493, 1494, there were originally 300,000 Taino living in the Bahamas and Cuba. In 2 years, by 1494, there were 250,000. So 50,000 of them had already died. In 2 years, 50,000 had died. Think what that would do to your communities. And it'd get even worse by 1548, so less than 100 years later. This is what, almost 50 years later, a little bit more than 50 years later? There were 500 Taino left. So that's 299,500 Taino who in the space of 50 years, give or take, died. And this is a heavy subject because they died not only because of disease, but they also died because of work, because the Spanish didn't want to kill them. They wanted to put them to work in the mines and into the plantations to make money for Spain. And this is a big recurring theme throughout colonization, whether it be in Africa, South America, or North America, is that colonization occurs for the exploitation of goods and services and people. And it gets even worse in Mexico. You think the Taino is a bad example. Say, oh, that's just one case. It gets really bad in Mexico. Mexico had around 10 million people living in it pre-Columbus. All right, you ready for this? By 1620, so, 100 years after the conquest of the Aztec Empire, 90% of them are dead. That means from a population of 10 million, there's only 1 million left. And again, this goes back to what happened to the Taino. Disease kills them. In droves, disease kills them. And then in the Mississippian culture as well, the Mississippian culture just disappears. It's gone. We have remnants of the Aztec Empire that we can look at and say, oh, they lived there, they lived there, they lived there. The only remnants we have of the Mississippian culture are the mounds they left. The people disappeared. And they fled into the hills as their communities collapsed around them because of all these diseases that the Spanish bore, and eventually the English too, bore into the New World. It completely wiped out your urban centers because so many people live in such close communication to one another that if you have smallpox, even breathing the same air as someone who has smallpox can make you have smallpox. And within 14 days, smallpox is more than likely going to kill you if you're a Native American. So the urban centers just completely collapse as people die and as people leave. In fact, so many people flee to the hills from the Mississippian culture that they end up creating some Native American tribes we've probably heard of today. We're going to look at them later on when we get into American history and we get into the Indian removal policies of Andrew Jackson. But these are the 4 of the 5 civilized tribes: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Creek. The 5th civilized tribe of the Seminoles. But the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek are essentially the remnants of the Mississippian culture because the people just up and left. The urban centers were destroyed and vanished. All we have left are the hills. So this episode is titled The Fall of Eden because for many Indians, their Eden did fall. The lives they knew before the Europeans could never have been brought back. And I think one quote in particular is very telling about what exactly happened to Native Americans. And this comes from a Mayan living in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And he's talking about the old times before the diseases and the Europeans came. And he says, quote, "There was then no sickness. They had then no aching bones. They had then no high fever. They had then no smallpox. They had then no burning chest. They had then no abdominal pain. They had then no consumption. They had then no headache. At that time, the course of humanity was orderly. The foreigners made it otherwise." This is HQ, signing off for now. See you next time.